And welcome to our webinar, folks, with Monica Halan and the subject of financialization. The way we will set the scene is my colleague Tej Shah, who's the fund manager of Marcellus Kings of Capital Strategy. Tej will begin by sharing with us some of the facts on financialization in India. Then we'll move to Monica and she'll take us through her thoughts on what's happening in this shift, in this epic shift, perhaps once in a generation shift. What's happening in terms of the shift from physical savings to financial savings. And once Monica's slides are done, we'll move to Q&A mode. If you have questions, please start putting them as Tej and Monica do their presentations. Please start putting the questions in the Q&A box. And then once Monica's presentation is done, we'll go into Q&A mode and we'll try to take as many questions as we can in the next 58 minutes or so. So Tej, could I request you to kick off proceedings this evening?
Sure. Thanks, Saurabh. So what we'll discuss upfront right now, I'll just take all of you through some quick slides on what we are seeing on financialization in India. The first slide over here is on what we are seeing in the stock market and the Indian exchanges. What we have seen is that over the past 20 years, volumes on Indian exchanges have grown 20x. Volumes on the Indian exchanges in FY98 were around 5 trillion rupees. And that has now grown to almost about 100 trillion rupees over a period of 20 years. So whether it be the first decade of the 2000s, between 2000 to 2010, we saw 14% CAGR over the first decade in terms of volume growth. In the past 10 years as well, even on a higher base, we've seen a 6-7% CAGR. So what we are trying to show over here is that the volume growth on the Indian exchanges has been higher than what we have seen the Nifty grow by. And what that implies is that we are seeing a lot of participation from investors. Even if you look at the chart on the bottom left of the screen, what we are seeing is that the proportion of participation from retail investors is growing year by year. So this talk about Robinhood traders joining in the past 3 months or past 6 months, it has been a trend of sorts for the past 4-5 years actually. So we've seen that the total overall activity in the Indian exchanges, 37% of that were being contributed by retail investors in FY16. That has over a period of time grown to about 54%. So more than half of trade volume today comes from retail investors. Similarly, what we are seeing is that individual demat accounts over the past 10 years, year on year have grown in absolute terms. The new additions in individual demat accounts have grown from what were about 500,000, less than 500,000 in FY11 to about 4 million new demat accounts a year. So we see more and more people participating in terms of direct investing on the exchanges. Moving forward, so overall the pie of Indian financial savings is about $500 billion today. Half of that is in bank deposits. The other half is split between currency, insurance, mutual funds, etc. And not only do we see that the pie is expanding year after year, but what we'll also see is that this proportion will also change over the next decade. Maybe we'll see a lower proportion of money being put in currency, higher and higher amounts going into insurance funds, mutual funds, and more of bank deposits rather than money being put in currency. And that is what we have seen over the past 5-6 years. So we are seeing life insurance premiums grow at 18% at a sectoral level, mutual fund AUM grow at 18%, general insurance premiums also growing at 17%. This is what we are seeing at a sectoral level, that while GDP growth in nominal terms is 9, 10, 11%, financialization of savings is happening at almost twice that rate. Even the smaller insurers, even the smaller mutual funds that we are seeing, they are also seeing large flows. They are also being able to grow their AUMs, being able to grow their premiums at about 18-20% CAGR over the past 5 years. And coming to the larger macro picture, no other country apart from India, no other major economy apart from India has only 5% of its household wealth in financial savings. So we've taken the 10 largest economies in the world over here, 10, 11 largest economies of the world over here. This is data from the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report. And what we have seen is for these countries, about 20 to, in the case of US, almost 70% of their wealth is in financial assets. While this is just 5% in the case of India. And even if we were to take a conservative assumption that 5% moves up to 15% over the next 10 years, that's about 1% of wealth moving to financial assets every year. That is about $100 billion of wealth shifting to financial savings. And today we are at about $500 billion in financial savings. If $100 billion move every year, we'll be at about $1.5 trillion at the end of this decade. And this is on very conservative assumptions. We are assuming that the total pie of savings remains constant in India. And even assuming that, we'll see a 3x rise in the financial assets in India. And where will this money flow? Like we showed on the previous slide, this money will go to mutual funds, life insurance players, general insurers, rising bank deposits. And that is what we are playing in our Kings of Capital portfolio. That is what we are trying to build upon in the Kings of Capital portfolio, which we have recently launched last month. So that is it from my side. Over to you, Saurabh.
Thank you very much, Tejita. Thank you very much for a terrific introduction to the subject of financialization. Folks, I hope you can understand why we organize this session. It's a subject we are deeply excited about. Obviously, as portfolio managers, we get to see firsthand, live this whole experience of financialization. And I think the data Tej shared, life insurance premiums doubling in 5 years, mutual fund corpus more than doubling in 5 years. And remember, the last 5 years haven't been some insane bull run in India. It's not as if the country is booming. In spite of that, even second rung insurer, third rung mutual funds are doubling their corpus. And hence we decided we'll have a chat on the subject. So we'll move now to the star speaker of today, Monica Hallan. She's a best-selling author of this superb book, Let's Talk Money. It's a lucid book. It's a fluent book. बहुत मजा आएगा पढ़ने में. She's the best-selling author of Let's Talk Money. She's also a consulting editor at the Mint. She has an MA in economics from the Delhi School of Economics and journalism studies from the University of Wales. She's a very familiar face in Indian media, on TV series. She's been on several committees such as the Swaroop Committee, the Bose Committee, and I have the privilege of sitting with her on the SEBI Mutual Fund Advisory Committee. She's also the author of 2 academic papers, one of which I cited to my great satisfaction on the ULIP industry in coffee can investing, a preceding book. You can be sure the ULIP providers were not as happy about that paper, but it was a mind-blowing paper. It helped a lot of people understand what the ULIP industry is doing to us. So, so over to you, Monica, for your thoughts on this whole subject of where are we going with financialization in India.
Thank you so much, Saurabh. And this is a subject that I've discussed with you. I haven't had many people who agree with my views that if India is attempting to go to number 3 in the GDP pecking order, we want to grow from 3 trillion to 5 and then 10, you cannot have rules which worked for $300 billion GDP to work for a $5 trillion or a $10 trillion economy. So the closed club of elite people who would run the country at a much smaller scale, we cannot sustain that as we grow. So I have decoded the political changes as a response to the pouring of people into the Indian middle class. From a small elite upper middle class, it is far more democratized right now. And I want to actually share a small, very small slideshow here because, nothing sort of tells us about our relationship with money as Bollywood does. And we've really had a very difficult relationship because we've been a poor country, we've been a slave country, and there really was no way that you could get rich without doing something really bad. And Bollywood, the change in movies have captured this very well. So 50s, 60s, we're just out of the British yoke. We are a very poor country, and this evil guy is the moneylender, epitomized by this Mother India scene where, the power equation is so clear to see. So it's a rich, evil moneylender preying upon the poor. But then things begin to change. It's the 70s. And you see that the evilness has moved to a smuggler. So you can't be rich the right way. You can be rich with actually smuggling gold. Drugs wasn't such a big thing, it was gold. And the poor guy doesn't have much. The rich guy has a bangla, gadi, daulat, but the poor guy has his virtue, he has ma. So this whole equation about how you get wealth and what you do with it. And then there's another shift. This is Kala Patthar. Now you've become, the evil guy is the large corporate entrepreneur. So this whole dissing of entrepreneurs really has its roots in the late 70s, India's shift to socialism. I don't know how many people know, but the word socialist was introduced in our preamble only in the 70s. It wasn't there in the original preamble of the Constitution. So we took a whole shift towards socialism, towards state ownership, nationalized coal mines, nationalized banks, nationalized insurance companies, the whole nationalization, and the fact that the government was a better owner of assets than the private sector. And again, the rich guy in this is this evil corporate preying on the blood and sweat of the coal miners. Then 91 happens. And then 10 years later, you have this absolutely seminal movie called Dil Chahta Hai, which looks at wealth as a backdrop. It's not something which is in your face. There's a certain lifestyle that people are living and not ashamed of it. There's a woman who's drinking wine and she's not a bad girl. She's not a prostitute. That's the lifestyle. So there is a whole shift in the way that we look at wealth, where it is okay. Okay people, good people are now fairly wealthy. And then you have Gully Boy. Okay, this is a recent movie. And for me, this sort of put it all together, where a poor slum boy wants to make it big. He says, Apun ka time aayega, my time will come. And he wants it for himself. He wants the self-actualization, the wealth for himself. It's not like there's a dying mother or a manageable age sister. It is about him. So we've had a whole shift in the way we think of wealth. But our attitudes towards investing are still very 70s. We need new rules for the money. Hum hai naye, to andaz kyun hai purana? And that is something that I've been very passionate about, to talk to people, to say that don't get stuck in the asset choices of the 70s, because it was a very different time. And when I look at some of your question, some of you have been very kind to fill this survey, and I see the retirement question is there in most of the minds. The fact that it's a very confusing marketplace, so I can tell you to shift out of the old mindset, but when you come to the new marketplace, it is very confusing. There are trust issues. And a lot of you are also worried about the children's education. Your assets that you're holding are bank deposits, MF, PPF, EPF, but I've hardly seen any real estate, but I won't go into that. But I see that the shift is beginning to happen. And I'm hoping to talk to Saurabh through this hour and go through some of these issues in more detail. Saurabh.
Monica, the question's already coming through on the Q&A box that somebody who's 30 is asking, somebody who's 40 who's asking. The 50-year-old hasn't put his hand up or her hand up, but I presume he or she's also out there in the audience. Question people are asking is how much is enough? What should the size of my corpus be if I'm 30, 40, 50? How do I know what is the appropriately sized corpus? Now, I know this is a subject that Let's Talk Money talks about. It was a bit of an eye-opener even for me. So would love to hear from you on it.
Well, Saurabh, and so this is one of the questions that very Nobel Prize winning economists have said is a tougher question to answer than many of the other macroeconomic or microeconomic questions. The fact that you need to have a degree in futurology, in economics, law, you need a crystal ball to figure out what the world is going to be looking like 10, 20, 30, 40 years later. We don't know what inflation numbers, we don't know what happens next. And if you notice, the pace of change has only increased over the last few years. So it's one of the toughest questions, but what we can do is we can work through some rules of thumb. And as rules of thumb go, These are really very broad directions. So it's not a Google map which is getting you to the doorstep. You need professional help. Believe me, you need professional help for that, because these are tough questions to answer. This gives you a broad direction. It tells you the size of the problem, right? So these are numbers actually I crunched myself, and I do want you to know that I have overestimated expenses. I have overestimated inflation. I have underestimated return rates. All right. So I've taken a very conservative 8% return on retirement, and before that, a very conservative 10% return on your assets. And I have tried to get the corpus to last you till about 115 years.
Right.
You know, so I've done all of that, and the number which came to me that at 60, whatever your annual spend is, you need between 18 to 35 times of that. Okay, and I explained to you why this big, huge gap between 18 and 35. Whatever, so you have to predict what you're going to be spending at age 60. So whatever you're spending now, you will inflation adjust it to find that annual number. 18 times of that if you plan to eat fully into your corpus.
Right.
Now, this is something that the West does. I don't think we are very comfortable with eating into our corpus and not leaving our kids anything. But just to mark this space, to say 18 times you will need if you eat everything as you go through your retired life. You need 35 times if you plan to leave everything to the kids.
Right. Right.
A middle number of 26 times tells you that if you're spending 20 lakh at 60, you need 5.2 crore in assets that you can put to use to generate an income. Because remember, if you're living at 60, you have 30 to 35 years ahead of you. Inflation is not going away in a developing country like India. You've got to inflation adjust for 30 years. Your corpus has to stay with you till then. So I'm assuming that you eat half your corpus, half your giving up. So these are the numbers. And another quicker way of doing this is to look at your the net worth number as a multiplier of your current annual income. So at 40, you need 3 times of your current annual income. At 50, you need 6 times. At 60, you need 8 times.
Right.
Okay, so these are again large numbers, but it tells you the complexity of trying to predict for the future.
Right. So folks, in case you're furiously taking notes, you don't have to. Let's Talk Money page 174 has this data. Believe me, I used it for myself, so I know. And you also got to realize I don't have any vested interest in plugging this book. If anything, Monika's book is 2 steps ahead of Coffee Can Investing on the bestseller list. So by promoting her book, I'm depriving myself of sales, but that's completely fine because this is an outstanding book. So there are several questions on how do you go about calculating the corpus in page 174, and the chapter is relevant chapter is called My Retirement. Monika's given you the way to do the mental maths on how much you need to save at age 30, at age 40, age 50, age 60. Strongly recommend you read it. Now, from this arises the question. There are 2 strands of questions arising from this first, root sawal, kitna save karna chahiye. First question is, well, I already have savings in flats and gold and so on. So does that count in this corpus that you're referencing? And I'm sort of linked to that. I'm habitually used to saving through gold and real estate. So how do I suddenly abandon that and go to PMS and MF and AIF and all of this new jazz? I like buying flats and gold. Will that suffice for my retirement corpus?
Right. So the problem with gold is that it doesn't give any current income. So gold as an asset,
right,
doesn't throw off rent, interest, dividend. You can only profit from it,
right,
due to a change in the price of gold.
Right.
And that is also something which is fairly volatile. So if you take a very long-term return, it keeps you it just hedges for inflation. And gold again makes an excellent pool of liquid money, which you could use for instance, when the Corona crisis hit and you had gold ETFs, you saw the value go through the roof because in times of a crisis, gold prices rise. So it's great to have a 10% allocation to gold. But more than that, I think you are taking away from the growth potential of that money.
Right.
So let me just leave gold there. And also a new product, in the relatively new product, is the sovereign gold bonds, which don't give you liquidity, but do give you interest. All right. And they're also tax friendly on the long-term capital gains tax.
Right.
Coming to real estate, which has been the fix of Indian investors for so long. And again, I'm not blaming anybody. That is all that there was. I mean, 70s didn't have financial products. Land, as you can see, you can live in it, you can rent it out. The problem with real estate in India, according to me, has been the black money component.
Right.
So once you get onto this black money tiger and you invest with a black money component, then you are sort of bound for life to go on rotating that black money forward. So that's one piece of the real estate product, which is very difficult as India goes towards tightening rules around corruption and graft, which is happening. We can see it in some very high profile cases, how the banking sector also is being brought to book. So this is a process which will continue, because again, my first point, you cannot be a $10 trillion economy unless you're a banana republic with the kind of practices that we have seen in the banking sector, in the financial sector. So the focus on reducing black money, Benami Transactions Act, all of that will only increase. So that's one problem that I have with real estate. Second is that it has been, because of the big pipeline of black money, the real estate prices have been overblown in India. Because it is a sum, it is unrelated to the market value, to the real intrinsic value. And how do you think about that? So again, look at the difference between the way the yields on commercial real estate and residential real estate are taken. In residential real estate, they're always selling you this dream, price badega, ho jayega, where will people live? The whole conversation that land is going away. Land is not going away. Cities go vertical. It isn't as if that you'll run out of land. They just go up higher and higher. So I don't buy this thing that land is going to go away. And what you need to see as an investor is, what is my yield on my investment? So treat it like any other asset. You don't even count the costs of real estate, the cost of stamp duty, the cost of broker, the cost of maintenance, the threat of the cost of someone occupying your flat and not leaving, the cost of the lawyers, the cost of the legal case. We are not even thinking about those costs.
And Monica, the challenge is, I think I agree with you on this, but I keep meeting. Yesterday I was pitching to a H&W in the city of Bangalore, right? Chartered accountant, very qualified man. So I told him, much like you said, rental yield dekhiye sir, cost of borrowing dekhiye. And he said, Saurabh, whatever you're saying is bakwas hai. I have bought this flat in Bangalore. Look, I'm sitting here. मैं 20 साल पहले लिया था. ये flat इतना बढ़ गया है. Whatever consistent compounder वगैरह जो भी तुम बेचते हो, बेचते रहो. But मैं तो flat लूँगा Bangalore में. Bangalore में flats are the best thing ever. I have made money. My brother has made money. And, whilst I'm using this client as a case study, all of us meet people in our social life who claim that real estate has transformed their life. They were nothing 20 years ago. Now they are multi-millionaires, dollar terms mein, because of real estate. So what does one do with when one is faced with this whole bunch of case studies of people around them who said they owe their wealth to real estate, and here you are stupidly recommending that people invest their hard-earned wealth in Nestle and Asian Paints and Light and so on.
So actually, I've also had a lot of conversations, because social groups, they sort of get cornered and say, oh, mutual funds are bad, or financial assets, it's all a scam. So these wide statements, that scam hai. I find it useful to not argue with people who are convinced that they have a magic mantra or have a knack. Now, it could be that somebody really has a knack on real estate. Okay, so somebody is a real stock picker. It's fair enough to do that. Somebody understands real estate so well that he's able to suss out properties, which actually, it's like the ability to identify an Infosys before it became an Infosys. The ability to identify a multi-bagger investment on the stock market before it becomes, so I would look at those people who claim that they have made money on real estate, and believe you me, they're not counting all their costs. Okay. So they're looking over a 20-year period, they're looking at a CAGR, you include the costs. I'm not sure it looks that rosy.
Right.
And also the entire headache of dealing with this very clunky asset. I would actually ask them that what happens in an emergency if you have to liquidate your real estate asset? And these are real stories.
Right.
You hear of people who need to liquidate. There is, once the market figures out that it's a distressed sale, you get hammered down on price. Then people who bought around 2009, 2010, it's been 10 years. And if you inflation index the returns, you're sitting on a loss without counting the interest cost on your loan. So you're sitting on losses today over a 10-year period because real estate values. So initially they didn't fall. Then inflation caused the real value to fall. And now last 1 year, we've seen a collapse in prices. So I'm saying that I would just treat it as another asset. I would look at yield and say, if it is 1.5%, 2%, I'm actually better off in some other, even a ultra short-term debt fund is going to give me more. Then plus the headache of the entire clunkiness of this asset for professionals is a very difficult thing to deal with. So somebody who's really wedded to his real estate, I will say, okay, I'll figure it out. But anybody who's happy to listen to logic, to look at yields, to look at count in all the costs, I think it's a fairly compelling case that financial assets make on the ease, the liquidity, the transaction costs, all of that.
Right. So we'll move on to financial assets. My last real estate anecdote. So 4 years ago, I was sitting in a meeting with one of the richest men in Western India. And, he said, Dekho, as far as the eye can see, ye sari zameen hamari hai. And, there's some horses were grazing there, and incredibly wealthy man. So I said, how long have you owned this land? He says, it's been in the family for 50 years. And, it's risen 10x in 50 years. So I, stupidly said, I shouldn't have said it, but, these sorts of things happen to people like me. I said, sir, had you sold this land in 1979 and invested in the Sensex, if you just put it in the Sensex, you would have compounded at 11% from 1979 to now. Your wealth would be triple of what it is, right? And he just lost it with me. That was a client meeting I screwed up, which is why I think my salespeople keep me away from these sorts of client meetings. But now let's move to the other set of questions which are coming. People are saying, well, Monica, you are saying financial assets mein invest karo. But we've had the Franklin Templeton fiasco. Mutual funds, is it the right way to go? A lot of people in here are saying mutual funds haven't made that much money in the last 10 years. So yes, we understand we've got to move out of physical to financial, but where do we go? Can mutual funds really deliver for us? How do we invest in financial assets?
Yeah, I think that onboarding has been very, very difficult. And part of the problem has been the regulatory arbitrage between different products in the market. And within mutual funds, we've seen a tightening of regulations for the last 15 years. So there has also been a change in the way the regulator looks at the market. And there has been more and more effort to prevent fund managers from playing with investors' money. Now, the question of that you've not really made money, then it comes down to saying that it is really the choice of the fund. So there are two ways that you can go. You can buy the index through an ETF, or you can do a managed fund.
Right.
If you're doing it yourself and you buy an index fund, then you just simply at a very low cost write the index. It's a separate conversation, and this is something, Saurabh, you and you've spoken about that. The value expansion is happening outside. But for people who cannot do stock picking themselves, an ETF remains one of the best ways of fill it, shut it, forget it. But if you either are able to evaluate funds yourself, are able to manage your portfolio, then some of the managed schemes have done extremely well. And again, it is an asset allocation that you create. You don't buy last year's winner. So some of the problems that we have also, looked at when people come with their portfolios and for an audit and all that, you realize that an entry-level person into the markets is being straight away going towards the mid and the small caps. This is when the small cap, mid cap rally was happening. That's not how you start. You start with a broad market fund. You start with something far more conservative.
Right.
And I think for financialization really to happen, this lesson of asset allocation is so important. The fact that the allocation between debt and equity, debt, gold and equity is so important. And within equity, the allocation between the large cap, the safer part, the less risky part, plus the returns kicker with the mid cap and small cap, you must have that allocation for you to get returns which are higher than the benchmark. So again, it's a very complicated conversation, and I really feel that without proper advice, it is very difficult for an average person to create their portfolio. It's even more difficult to maintain it as you go along, because more and more new information comes and the portfolio bloat happens. So ideally, you either invest into finding a really good planner or advisor, but that doesn't stop you from actually understanding the markets, mutual funds, and at least figuring out what questions should you be asking. For instance, you cannot be in the market without understanding what a benchmark is.
Right.
So a fund manager can come and tell you, oh, I did 100% return last year. Yeah, but the Sensex went up 102, so you underperformed. Right? So there are certain, I wish financial literacy would focus on questions to ask your advisor planner in terms of evaluating their performance, evaluating how the chosen products have done, rather than just explaining products.
Right. So just to be clear, what you're suggesting is that people go to a SEBI registered investment advisor, someone who charges you a fee and gives you a financial plan, and then just like you go to a sort of dentist or a doctor periodically, you keep going to the financial planner and stay abreast of it. Right. Now, one challenge that I've seen lots of people face, and it's being asked here as well. Well, how do we differentiate between somebody who's a product salesperson, right, and a financial planner? Because they dikhte sare ek jaise hain. How do we know who's a financial planner who'll work in my benefit, and who's actually just a product salesman selling me? Could be Marcellus PMS for all you know, but he's a salesperson. How does a member of the public distinguish between these two?
I wish there were more lists out there, but there are some lists which put down the fee only financial planners.
I see.
So that those lists exist. Plus, I think going through a recommendation is usually a great idea. So if somebody in your network has worked with an advisor planner and have had a good experience, that's one way to go. I mean, how do you find a doctor really? You don't look up the yellow pages. You don't search on the internet. You call up your trusted friend and say, I have a problem in my eye. Where do I go? I have a toothache. Where do I go? So ideally go through a reference and try and talk to 3 people before you settle on one, because it is in that conversation that you will realize whether the planner's value system matches your own. I mean, see, there are all kinds of planners out there. There are planners who are so conservative, they're so moralistic that maybe an average person is unable to do that high level of, that high value moral ground, maybe too high.
Right.
In terms of a conservative lifestyle, I may want a better lifestyle today. So you will actually, it's a very difficult match to have your planner and you exactly on the same page. So I would actually get references, talk to 3 people, and then figure out the best fit. And in the first few years, be very, very suspicious, ask lots of questions, constantly review the products, send it to people that you trust to say, this is the portfolio. Do you think it's looking good? Once that trust has been built, then it's really on autopilot. But I mean, the way that you find a doctor or lawyer, find your planner like that.
Right. So folks, therefore, for all of you asking, saying 30-40 crore debt equity, how much should I save at what age? I'll reiterate again. Step 1, read a good book on personal finance. Let's Talk Money's Monika's book. I've written a book called Coffee Can Investing. Read a good book. That's a decent start. Then find a financial planner, somebody who takes a small fee for you to help you plan your financial goals. First identify your goals and then your plan. If you want a recommendation, reach out to somebody at Marcellus. There's a couple of people we reference people to. We don't get any kickbacks from them. We just do it as a service for our clients, because as Monica said, it's hard to know whether people will end up with the right planner or otherwise. So if you need a financial planner, drop us an email. We'll refer you to a couple of people and up to you to choose from them. But a lot of you are trying to make these sorts of asset allocation decisions on the fly. The attempt is laudable, but to the extent it's your financial future on the line, you might want to get expert advice. This is now the world's 5th largest economy, and to believe that you can do DIY financial planning for yourself and your loved ones, I think is a little bit of a ambitious ask.
Saurabh, can I just tell you that I've written a book.
Okay.
I swing my decisions past a financial planner.
There you go. My God.
Okay. So I'm not a practitioner. I don't take clients. I do not practice commercially. There is knowledge which comes by handling products, by which a planner does. I take advice from a planner. So this is how important it is.
So if Monica is taking advice, I think rest of us have to also heed her and have an advisor next to us as we.
One more anecdote. I met David Kahneman's financial planner long back.
Okay.
David Kahneman, the father of me, right? And she said that he makes all the mistakes that he writes about. What you do in theory and practice are two different things.
Right. I think my wife will say the same thing about me, unfortunately. Right. So let's move to a happier subject. Now, what's very interesting is not one person on this Q&A has asked any questions about insurance. किसी ने एक सवाल भी नहीं खड़ा किया, and obviously it's a subject that's discussed in your book, Monica. How do you suggest people view insurance? Because there's this view that, well, insurance to investment nahi hai, insurance is something else. Here we are discussing, like grown men, we're discussing how to make loads of money. Insurance is a different subject. So where does insurance, both health and life insurance, feature in the financial landscape for an Indian affluent person?
The way that I look at it is that unless you have medical insurance and life insurance, and I'll come to what kind you need to have, you can never put money down long-term in financial assets or in any other asset. Now you need to think of building safety nets around your life and money.
Right.
And one way is to build an emergency fund, which prevents you from dipping into your long-term savings. The other thing is when a medical emergency comes, do you liquidate your savings or do you have a stash in a medical insurance policy that you use? Life insurance is similar, that if something happens to you, your family has a large pool of money which takes them through their rest of their lives. I would look at medical and life insurance in the context of allowing your rest of your money to work long term. The need for keeping money near cash goes away once you've built your emergency fund, you've got a good medical insurance policy, and you've got a term life policy in place. Then your money can go to work long term. Coming to this medical insurance, today Mint has launched the 2020 Mediclaim ratings. It is very difficult. Like I say in the book, it is one of the toughest things to figure out. Do look at that rating, because we are rating across benefits, claims. Price is only a part of the conversation. So the benefits will include things which you may not, you will hear only once you go to make a claim.
Right.
Is things like exclusions, things like sublimits on rooms, things like disease waiting period. And then we talk about, so please do look at that, because you really need a policy which will pay when the rubber hits the road. Life insurance is probably the most missold, misbought financial product. The only product that everybody needs is a pure term life cover. You don't need to buy a bundled insurance. These are traps that 35 trillion rupees of investor money is caught in. And this is where household money goes to die. So just buy a pure term life cover. The tax break that the agent is giving you as a carrot can be got in PPF, in your PF, in ELSS, in principal of your home loan. The rebate that he's offering you is going to really blow back in your face. He's telling you that I'll give you half your premium back. That's the worst money decision that you can ever make. So let go of that rebate, get your tax break elsewhere. Just keep your money, your premium in a term life insurance plan. So that's what I have to say on insurance.
In Monica's book, folks, there's 2 chapters which I wish I had read when I migrated to India more than a decade back. One is a chapter called Building Your Protection, and the second is a chapter called What If You Die, right? And I wish Monica had written this book a decade back. The worst investment in my life, and I unwound it with great difficulty, was an LIC product which bundled insurance and investment. And it took me 8 years of investing in the product to figure out that the returns were lower than a 10-year government bond yield. And finally, with a lot of effort 4 years ago, I unwound it. It was just difficult to get even any money back from LIC. And I remember now, as I investigated deeper, the entirety of my first year premium payment, the entirety of it went to the distributor.
Agent, yeah.
To the agent, right? And obviously I had a fun.
Saurabh, if you allow, I'm going to show you just 3 slides on this.
Go for it.
I really want people to see this because, we don't realize why they are selling what they are selling. Okay. So this is your first year premium. Okay. So the commission legally is up to 42,000, but illegally it's your entire premium. Okay.
Right.
There are very high surrender costs. If you change your mind after the first premium and you don't pay the second, you lose your entire money. Nothing comes back to you. If you pay 2 premiums and you don't pay the third, out of 2 lakh, you get 60,000 back. This is called a surrender cost. Okay. If you pay 3 premiums and you don't pay the fourth, you've invested 3 lakhs, you get 1 lakh back. If you pay 5 premiums, you pay 5 lakh. After 5 years, and they sell it like a 5-year policy, and you don't pay the 6th, you get 2.5 lakh back. And this was I did the numbers, and this is a shocker. The red line is what you get back if you decide not to pay the next premium. This is a 22-year policy, tenure policy. At every point till year 21, your invested amount is what you get back is lower than what you invested.
Yeah.
At the end of the policy, you suddenly get a 3% CAGR return. This is the insurance story.
So yeah, so I've been through that red line wala piece, and anyway, let's just move on to happier topics. The message to people out there is don't do blends, don't do this blended insurance and investment in one product. It's very difficult to get a great deal. Term life is a good thing. There's good term life vendors out there. We've invested in one of them in our Kings of Capital portfolio, indeed in our CCP as well, but don't do the blend. Now, a whole bunch of questions have started. There's some on this Q&A, and increasingly in our client meetings also people ask us, how much should we invest outside India? So using our LRS, using the LRS allocation that everybody had, should I do 50-50, आधा US में, आधा India में, because US is a booming economy, हमारा देश भगवान जाने क्या होने वाला है. So should I put half my money? What's the advice on Indians' newfound interest in investing overseas?
It's a really interesting question because some of the tech funds have done like 40% return in the last year.
Yeah.
And typically I find the investor interest begins to come once they see returns
Yeah.
of last year's winner.
Yeah.
So I would really encourage people to think about foreign exposure as a strategy and not a bounce in, bounce out. I usually talk to people about expanding their asset allocation with a slice of foreign investment once their portfolio size is large enough to be able to diversify and take that currency risk and foreign market risk. So it's a great idea once you have already experimented with Indian mutual funds or Indian financial assets, you have your asset allocation in place, and now your asset pie is increasing. It's a great idea to have, I would put a quarter of my money in, assets, especially in the US, because that's, typically it's been a growth economy. It's rewarded innovation, but to have a global fund outside of India and allocate your 25% across different verticals also makes a lot of sense. Because, we are in India, and I don't think that we have an option but not to grow. We have no option but to grow. Because if we don't grow, the population pressure of the millions pouring into the workforce is going to cause deep social unrest. So my personal view is that there is no option for India but to grow. That growth reflect on markets. You please keep your money here. A quarter of your money can go out and invest abroad. So then you get a nice asset allocation. And again, this percentage is to be again discussed and fixed according to your risk level with your planner. These are very rough rules of thumb.
That's super advice. So folks, there you have it. Monica Hallan is saying, consider having quarter of your corpus in overseas equities. And again, if there are certain fund recommendations you want from us, where some of our colleagues have put money, if you write to us purely as help, we're not advisors on overseas equities in any shape or form. As a matter of help, we're happy to recommend or point you towards. I think the appropriate phases, we're happy to point you towards some overseas funds which we think are very similar to what Marcellus does in India. Invest in clean, well-run, high-quality companies which compound nicely over long periods of time. So, Monica, let's come to perhaps the most contentious subject, right? We've all seen what's happened to debt funds. There's lots of questions being asked in this Q&A on debt funds. We know not every debt fund house will end up in the Franklin type situation. But we also know that there's a whole range of debt fund offerings, right? Both in terms of maturity, so ultra short, to all the way to credit risk funds. And for every single class, we also know there's a different amounts of credit risk being taken in a set class. Is there any straightforward way for an Indian HNW to figure out which debt funds are appropriate for her and which ones to stay away from?
At the moment, there isn't, and it's a really great question, because we've all thought of debt funds as the gradation from FDs to debt funds and savings deposits to liquid overnight funds. But the events of the last few years have sort of torn that argument to shreds because of the action of a few fund houses. And we must remember that half of the assets in debt funds are held by institutions, whereas about 80 to 90% of the assets in equity are held by retail investors. So the fund managers in debt funds are tempted to squeeze out extra returns to satisfy the institutional investor, and then takes far too much risk. So either you understand debt funds and you understand words like duration, liquidity, and credit risk. If you don't understand these, you need advice.
Right.
You don't have advice and you don't understand liquidity, duration, credit risk, you are better off in a fixed deposit till the time that the regulator puts in rules of road rules, and we are able to label the risk in debt funds better. You are better off in a fixed deposit unless we have better labels, or you understand it yourself, or you have good advice. The Templeton example that you take, these were identified funds for high-risk investors, right? People who wanted that return. Now, if somebody is offering you a return on a particular debt category where the average is 8 and you are getting 14, you're getting equity returns on debt, should you not ask the question that what is the fund manager doing to get me this extra return? Higher return will always come with higher risk. I mean, this is a mantra that you must always say, that if some deal, the full page ads which are coming today on real estate deals of double your money, who can assure doubling of your money, and why would you even believe them? So higher return will always come with higher risk, and you need to be prudent when you're dealing with financial assets to be able to either understand the portfolios yourself or get good advice.
So folks, I think Monica said something which I think goes to the heart of the issue, and she's made this point a few minutes back. If you can't understand the product, any product, right? If you can't understand the product, don't invest, because your the salesman in front of you is recommending it. Get yourself advice. And as she said, she herself has a financial advisor who helps her with her investments. And I think there's a message there for all of us. Now, one question that we are getting, and we get this even in Marcellus meetings, is how do we convince our partners or our parents, so I guess spouses or parents, who are not very comfortable about investing in equities or MF? How do we, I suppose the person is asking, how do we convince them to invest in equities? Because, you know, my wife or my husband or my parents are saying, nahi karna, you know, do the tried and trusted jewelry kharido, land kharido. How do we persuade them? Any thoughts, Monica, other than reading Let's Talk Money?
So this is, you know, the toughest conversations are at home. And this is, I have spoken to so many people in the financial sector. One, they don't take you seriously at home, okay? And which is good for the ego, okay? Nobody takes you seriously at home. So you may be like the biggest speaker on finance, but your dad will say, hey, you know, what is this mutual fund? Sab chor hai ji. You know, so those are really difficult conversations. The spouse piece may be a little easier, because usually it's the men who decide and women tend to go along with whatever the men are saying. The problem is if the woman is smarter and understands and is trying to convince the husband who's sitting with his ego and all that, that is really a tough one. So what sometimes works is to get the spouse who's reluctant to a planner just to have a conversation, or to introduce them to a trusted friend who is also on the planning journey, is convinced that it works for him or her, and then slowly introduce. Because especially in relationships, I think there is this, you know, the blind spots that if you're saying it's not, it helps to have a third person into the conversation to say, you know what, this is what smart people are beginning to do. And maybe we can try talking to a planner. The parents' conversation is even tougher, because there are all kinds of other issues involved in terms of, you know, succession issues, sibling issues. So what I believe is money is only the, you know, it's an outward physical thing. Behind this is a minefield of emotional parental relationship issues. So, you know, I really don't know. So my own story is that my father finally got convinced moving his FTs to mutual fund portfolio about 10 years ago. And since then he's been on a SWP, and it sort of finally worked in him when he was in his 70s to say, maybe you've got something to say.
Right. Any websites, Monica, which you'd recommend for, say, figuring out which health insurer, which mutual fund? Are there websites you find particularly useful for your work in terms of which health insurer or mutual fund or life insurer to use?
So health insurance, I just said we have Mint Secure now Mediclaim ratings. You can look at the A-rated plans, but you need to spend some time figuring out what works for you.
Right.
Mutual funds, Mint also does Mint 50. It's a short list of funds. You don't need 50. You can pick the ones which work for you. Again, portfolio creation is an expert's job. But if you think that you can pick and create your portfolio, do that. Smart investors pick the funds out of Mint 50, and then they pass it through filters of value research rating, Morningstar rating.
Right.
So if your fund chosen is passing through 3 completely different sets of ratings and is doing fairly well, I think, again, you're just trying to reduce the risk out there. So I find value research data a really good source. Morningstar data is a good source. Pass that set of funds through different filters to see, does it still do fairly well? And remember, you're not picking last year's winner. You're picking funds in the top, 25% of the band. If your fund is consistently in the top 25%, it's doing fairly well. The last year's winner could be next year's loser completely. You want what is called risk-adjusted return.
Right.
So when markets are doing well, it does okay. When markets are not doing well, it doesn't fall that much. So people who have existing portfolios should evaluate how their portfolios did in March and April this year. If you fell less than the market, you've got a good portfolio, right? And when the bounce back happens, you may not bounce back as much as some of the other portfolios out there. But when the markets fall, you don't fall as much. When they rise, you may not be the winning fund out there, but you've done better than the benchmark. So those are some of the things that you can keep in mind.
Sure. So what I'll do is I'll spend 4 or 5 minutes just answering some of the questions people are asking about how asset managers and life insurers make money, and then I'll hand it back to you, Monica, for final thoughts on how people can go on this journey. There's clearly just the sheer number of people, both who have dialed in and who are asking questions, suggests very high interest in the subject. So just to sort of, a whole bunch of you are saying that in Tej's slides, the comparators he gave were Western countries, and we didn't give Brazil or Indonesia. You can find the data for yourself. We showed you a bunch of countries because those are the most relevant ones. There is no country at $2,000 per capita income with a ratio of physical to financial assets as low as India. As Tej said, we are 95% physical, 5% financial. You can go to the RBI website. There's something called the RBI Household Finance Survey. It was published in August 2017. It's an outstanding piece of work. And the RBI's website, you can download the survey. It's a 100-page survey. And the survey will show you there is no other country in the world, forget $2,000 per capita, at no per capita income, is there a country with 95% physical, 5% financial. The RBI survey itself dwells on aisa kyun hai, why is India so skewed towards physical assets. Euphemistically, they obviously can't say this clearly, so euphemistically they basically say कि ये black money की वजह से है. Because of black money, we are heavily swayed towards physical assets, and there is no historical precedent for this sort of incredible skew. And that's why we keep saying in our webinars, and they said today, that if you take a more sensible skew, 85-15, let's assume that we go 85 physical, 15% financial, that will mean that every year we'll have to add 1% of our, we'll have to swing 1% from physical assets to financial assets. If we do that, aaj 5 pe hai, 10 years hence we'll be at 15. That will mean that we'll add around $100 billion a year to financial assets. We're at $500 billion of financial assets. Just think about it. Country became independent in 1947. Azadi ke 70 years after independence, all we have is $500 billion of financial assets. That makes no sense at all in a country with $10 trillion of household wealth. So our reckoning is, conservatively, we'll end up with $1.5 trillion of financial assets a decade hence, right? In that context, almost without heeding, right? We're not even going into the sort of inner nitty-gritty of Konsa mutual fund and Konsa life insurer. Companies who put up reasonably credible products, reasonably solidly run, reasonably credible products, who do a decent job, are bound to make lots of money. And as Tej showed you, using the AMFI data, mutual fund corpus has more than doubled in the last 5 years. The big four have comfortably, actually the big four have reached actually tripled in the last 5 years. Many mutual funds, many life insurers who have not done anything special by way of performance have seen a exponential jump in their assets under their care. Why is that? As we travel around the country, the answer to that is evident. If you go to places like Jalandhar, Ludhiana, Erode, Coimbatore, Durgapur, places like that, you ask the local IFA, or the local wealth manager, what does the public want to buy? They will tell you, everywhere they'll tell you, people want to put money in HDFC MF. Why do they want to put money in HDFC MF? The consistent refrain you'll hear in smaller towns and cities in India is, the public trusts the HDFC brand. A lot of them think actually they're putting money in HDFC Bank. If the IFA or the wealth manager says, let me show you performance, the public says, a performance apne paas rakhiye. We trust this house and we want to give them money, right? And therefore, no surprises. The top 3 MFs are all bank subsidiaries. HDFC, ICICI Prudential, SBI, right? And it's very difficult for others to catch up with them. But more general point we're making is just the sheer blast up in corpus in a 5-year period where the stock market wasn't doing so well, the country wasn't doing so well, and in spite of that, you're seeing big jumps, and hence we are saying, think of financials think of financial services as an asset class to invest in. Obviously, back clean, well-run companies, and you benefit from India's impending financialization. Some of you are saying that, well, Blackstone invest kar raha hai real estate mein, to main kyun na karu, right? Blackstone is not buying flats in Noida or Gurgaon. They are buying offices in BKC. They're not even buying offices in BKC. They're buying entire buildings in BKC at pennies to the pound. If you can negotiate tower blocks in Bombay and business parks in Delhi at pennies to the pound, bilkul kijiye. But if you're thinking of buying a flat in Gurgaon or Lower Parel or Bandra or in Salt Lake in Kolkata, please think again. As Monica said, rental yields on these properties are 2 or 3%. Your interest rate is 8%. You'll have to do some incredible capital compounding, wealth compounding. Just to put it in perspective, the flat I am sitting and talking to you from costs thrice as much as my parents' house in London, which has 2 gardens, right? So if you think residential real estate in India will make money, then you're welcome to believe that. Blackstone is not saying that. Blackstone is buying tower blocks and business parks at pennies to the pound, which I think is a smart way for them to make money. Yes, I think we are recording the webinar. We will put it on the website, so आप फिर जाके सुन सकते हो वहाँ पे. So I think that's it for my summary. Monica, any final thoughts from you?
Yes, Saurabh, absolutely. If you don't have a plan in place, if you constantly shift your decision making as to what you're investing in, you will never make money. The people who are onboarding you will make the money, but you will never make consistent money, and you're always going to remain worried, because people without conviction in their plans in March sold their entire equity portfolio when the market was down 30%, believing some scaremongering PPTs put out by people who were smartly buying stocks those days. The scaremongering was that markets will fall forever. Now, especially when there is panic or greed, you have to be very pragmatic. When there's panic, you have to remember that we are not going back to caves. We are not going back to horse buggies. We will continue to consume things we consume. Growth will come back. And when there is over exuberance, you have to remember that froth at some point will fade away. So it's a little bit like a yogic thought in your head that you should always be balanced about your money, neither greedy nor fearful. And that only will come if you have a very well thought out financial plan that you very deeply have participated in and agree with. Only then do you stop looking at the value of the Sensex. I don't know on a particular day where the market is. I don't care.
Right. So Monica doesn't care. She has a financial advisor who does a lot of the heavy lifting. You folks should look for one as well. Before you go there, let's talk money from Monica Ahlan, and Coffee Can Investing from yours truly is there to guide you. If you need reference to a financial advisor, drop us an email. We'll refer you to a couple of people, up to you to choose them. Thank you very much, Monica. There was a lot of fun. Thank you for writing the book and for joining us for now. And thanks everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Saurabh. Thank you everyone for dialing in. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.